Hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation With, a Siemens podcast that delves into the role of technology in driving sustainable economies. My name is Tumi and I am your host. Today's episode is a little bit different. We're veering slightly away from the tech and getting into the heart of ethics and responsible business practices. Today we're discussing compliance and good governance. We're in conversation with Charles Murray, former head of compliance for Siemens Sub-Saharan Africa. Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Tumi. Good day.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role as head of compliance for Siemens Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, I started with Siemens about 10 years ago, actually as a commercial graduate on the BAT training program. So I started off in wind power at that stage, made my way through accounting and controlling, and ended up in legal. And I think most colleagues will remember me from the legal days. Spent a long time as legal counsel before taking up the role of compliance, which I did for the last 4 years. So that's me in a nutshell.
And what exactly is compliance and good governance mean to Siemens South Africa?
So in the words of Sabina, our CEO, I would want to say compliance is our license to do business. It's what we put out to the market. We want to be a brand that people can trust, not just for our technology, but because the brand also represents clean business.
What is clean business?
Free from corruption, free from money laundering, a brand that you can trust. There's no non-compliance with laws, that we actually stay true for what we believe in, firstly, in terms of always complying with the law, but secondly, also acting in accordance with our business conduct guidelines and our ethical principles.
Can you describe a little bit the compliance framework for Siemens? What's in place?
Our compliance framework revolves around our compliance areas of responsibility. Now, these include specifically anti-corruption, anti-money laundering, competition law, data privacy, export control, and importantly also human rights. So our whole system is built on these areas of responsibility where we have our prevention rules, we have our rules, we have our processes in place, and through that we also monitor, detect any shortcomings, identify risks, and of course react and mitigate those when we pick up either increased risks or violations of rules.
How does Siemens ensure that its compliance programs are up to date with local and international regulations?
Firstly, we have a very strong compliance organization at a headquarter level. So, of course, there's constant monitoring of the developments and regulations and legislation around the world. So we've got a very, very strong legal framework team within compliance who actually works on a lot of these topics. And then they rely on us, the compliance officers in the countries, such as myself, to also stay abreast of any local law developments. So how we really do this is we at all times comply with the Siemens rules, which we set up in accordance with international expectations, global legislation that we have in place. And to the extent that we then identify anything locally, in terms of our local laws, we adapt that also to ensure we're always in compliance with both. So a big role there is also played by the local legal and compliance team to see when we have changes in legislation, new regulations coming out, that we also adapt our system accordingly.
I would assume that working from a local perspective with our headquarter teams can be a little bit difficult. What are some of the challenges that you face in maintaining compliance across the different regions?
From an African perspective, I think one of the biggest challenges is the vastness of our continent. I mean, we stretch over a very, very huge geographical area. We have various jurisdictions, both from a civil law and a common law tradition. So it's not that it's just one legal system. It's not similar to the European Union, where you have a very strong regional international organization from a legislative perspective. But here we're also dealing with various laws in different countries, and of course also a bit of a language barrier sometimes. So for me, that's the biggest challenge in our region, is really to stay up to date also with some of the local developments there. And at the same time, also to ensure that we always bridge that language gap.
And how do you go about doing that, and also just managing and dealing with these challenges?
So what we have in place is also through our legal colleagues. We have a network also of law firms on the African continent who can also assist us when we have specific changes in legislation coming up. But the general principles underlying some of these laws are very well familiar also to Siemens as an organization. And we in essence also there adapt our systems in accordance with the local support that we also receive. It's always for us important to get that input also from from legal colleagues and legal experts within country to ensure that we always abide by the laws wherever we operate and that we don't become complacent in that regard.
You've just highlighted something. I want to talk about collaboration. I know it's not part of the questions that I've handed over to you, but collaborations, besides our headquarter collaboration with Siemens, South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, what collaborations exist outside of that structure?
So collaborations in that regard, the most important collaboration, of course, is with business. For me, it's one of the key parts of being a country compliance officer to stay close to our business colleagues. They are the ones out facing customers. They're the ones actually facing these risks. And if you don't know the business, it's very difficult to advise on it as well. So I would say that's for me one of the most important collaborations in that regard. It's very important for us to ensure that we have that strong synchronization between the functions. Of course, we have different responsibilities, but a very closely aligned type of work that we do to ensure on the one side that we ensure compliance, but that we also have the legal colleagues supporting, especially in instances where we have issues picked up within the business.
I want to talk about good governance. Can you give me a brief definition of that and what steps Siemens has taken to integrate good governance practices into its corporate culture?
Well, good governance for me, in essence, it starts on the compliance side, especially, starts with our business conduct guidelines. It applies to all our employees from the managing board of Siemens down to you and I. So for me, that almost lays the foundation of good governance within our entity, and to ensure that anything that we do, that we set up our processes and procedures in accordance with those principles and rules. And that for me lays the foundation of good governance.
Please provide some examples of how good governance has positively impacted Siemens' operations and the reputation in South Africa.
Well, I think in terms of good governance, let's say examples in South Africa, it's quite easy. If you think of the corporate scandals we've seen over the last decades and how that negatively impacts the reputation of large companies, including multinationals. Now, it's also during this time that we stay true to our values, to our belief system and our rules to ensure that we also become a trusted company. And we've actually become trusted because of that. What we've seen over the last 12, 15 years, we've seen a big, let's say, loss of trust by a large portion of the population in South Africa in multinationals and corporates. And here, through our consistent application of our rules and staying true to our compliance culture, that's also where we made that difference. So for me, that's a very important thing to consider, that example of good governance. It's almost an opposite example where I'm telling you, let's see what bad governance does. And for me, that almost speaks as the example of what good governance leads to. It doesn't lead to headlines. You're not going to reach the front page of the newspapers because of good governance. It's the opposite that lands you there. And for me, taking pride in the fact that we stay true to our rules and our governance principles.
Let's get into that loss of trust. Where does that come from?
What we've seen over the last few decades is the general trust that one expects has moved away from governments a lot towards corporate entities. A few decades ago, governments were in essence responsible to run the economy. People depended on government to develop, to create jobs, to ensure that people have a decent living. And we've seen this emergence of really, really big players in the corporate world. And there comes big responsibility as well. Some entities are bigger than the GDPs of countries. We really see a lot of power there. And when you lose trust from people, it doesn't need to be your customer base, that can also really do a lot of damage to you. And we've seen an increase in this expectation from people to work and have companies that act ethically in what they do, not just blind compliance with the law, but always wanting to do the right thing, contributing to society, whether it be environmental, social, or through governance, which we're also addressing today.
How does Siemens South Africa identify and mitigate compliance risks?
So we do our risk identification on a continuous basis. It's not a type of one-time thing. We do have also, as part of our global organization, where we on an annual basis see what type of risks are emerging at a global level, of course, and then also seeing within countries and regions what type of risks are emerging. So it's a very continuous process. It's through what we see in business. It's what we see in the trends also in the economies where we operate. And of course, always on the compliance side, when we see new regulations coming out, that also sometimes brings specific risk to an entity to ensure that we comply and mitigate those risks to the extent necessary.
You highlighted earlier that compliance also falls quite a lot, not only on the legal and compliance department, but obviously the employees of the organization. What sort of training programs does Siemens offer to ensure that all employees are aware of the compliance and governance policies?
I'm very glad you bring that up. It's a very important principle to understand that it's not the compliance officer or the compliance department who ensures that we are compliant. It's really the task of each and every one of our employees. And through that, we also need to always strive to have high levels of awareness and training. So what we have in place as part of the global compliance system, we have centrally rolled out trainings, which we roll out to the target employees within our organization. And with that, also a big role of managers, where managers also have the authority to assign certain trainings in the compliance sphere to colleagues who specifically need it. And when I say need it, not to say they're not acting compliantly, but really working in certain functions where more knowledge is needed. For an example, someone in a sales team may need some additional knowledge on export control. It's something that they will face on a daily basis. So through that, we've got a very, very strong central training team who works on these web-based trainings, which we roll out on a global basis. And not through that only, also through our communication methods locally. We have our integrity moments, which we also do with our employees, where we also share bits and pieces of important information with our colleagues on key hot topics that arise also throughout the year and what we see developing within the country.
And how does the company manage compliance and governance when working with third-party suppliers and partners?
This is one of the very crucial areas of compliance for Siemens. On the one side, we've got our partners, and a lot of the compliance obligations here stem from international legislation, such as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the United States. And that places a very big responsibility on an entity such as Siemens to also ensure that we manage those partners that we work with, those potential intermediaries, which in the world has often been used as conduits for corruption and for financial crimes. So we've got a very, very strong focus on that through our formerly known the business partner process that you may recall. It's now called third-party intermediary process. And on the other side, on the supplier side, there we have our supplier code of conduct, where we ensure and we want to see that our suppliers also adhere to our values and our minimum requirements. Now, a lot of it stems from our ethical principle that also says we want to engage with reputable and law-abiding partners. Now, that goes both ways in terms of the partners we use for sales, but at the same time also for our suppliers. In terms of suppliers, we spend a substantial amount of money every year on suppliers. And we want to also ensure that when we spend funds, that the money that Siemens spend on their suppliers, it also goes towards sustainable business. And when I talk about sustainability, I'm not necessarily referring to traditional types of sustainability around environmental, but especially on the side of good governance and compliance and also ethics. So that's an important part for us to ensure that we do that. Added little bit of dimension we've got there. We also, as a German multinational, need to comply with the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act that also places additional obligations on German companies to ensure that their downstream suppliers also act compliantly and that we have good oversight and control to identify any shortcomings there. So it's a big thing for us, in essence, the partners and the third parties.
Let's talk about the role of technology in supporting Siemens compliance and governance efforts. Can you get into that a little bit?
Now, it's always played a role for Siemens. I think all our Siemens colleagues would be very well familiar with the tools and processes we have in place. It's been a big technology drive always within compliance to also make it easy for colleagues to use our compliance system. And we also continuously try to improve this. So we leverage off new technologies, also those developed by Siemens, to ensure that we make the lives of our colleagues easier in their compliance journey. But also to flip that around a little bit, and which I want to touch on a little bit, is also on technological advancements in terms of the products that we sell and we put out to the market. How we also need to constantly keep compliance in mind there. Technology is really evolving very fast. Legislation isn't always keeping up with it. And that's, again, where our ethical principles really come into play, to also ensure that with these technological advancements, that compliance also evolves with it, that we foresee those type of risks.
With the ever-changing tech landscape, how can we ensure that we stay ahead with the legislation?
Now, a lot of that comes back to the awareness I spoke about earlier. When we develop new technologies, to ensure that our employees are trained and know exactly what the compliance requirements are of them, to ensure that already as part of development of new products and technologies that we basically build in our fundamental principles. An example that we can talk about is data privacy by design. When we design applications, we by nature already want to design it to ensure that personal information is protected, irrespective of whether there's personal information laws in a country where we will roll out this product. So that's something that really helps us to stay ahead of it, to ensure when we develop in accordance with our ethical principles, with our business conduct guidelines, and what we already know as good business practices, makes it a lot easier to then incorporate that with legislation when such legislation comes out.
What are some of the biggest challenges Siemens South Africa faces in terms of compliance and governance?
In my view, this would definitely be South Africa's positioning from a geopolitical perspective. Geopolitical tensions have implications, particularly on the export control front. Take Russia as an example. The sanctions against Russia at that stage had a major impact on our operations around the world. So that changing environment really poses a challenge for us, not just on the export control side. It can also really translate into some other compliance challenges for us. And that's one of the areas where we have very little control over. We're entering a period of very, very strong political movements across the world, geopolitical tensions constantly arising, and we need to navigate these also as part of a multinational group. Now, a challenge like this arises in a country like South Africa. We don't have sanctions. And also for us to navigate this, to ensure and put in place the necessary safeguards to keep us within the confines of the law and the rules in which we need to operate.
And how does Siemens turn compliance challenges into opportunities for improvement and growth?
Well, we tackle these head on. When these changes come, and when I say these challenges, a lot of it comes from legislative changes. And tackling it head on also shows our regulators, but also the public, that we are a company that can be trusted, that people and our customers and the public at large can know that this is what Siemens does, this is what we stand for. And to buy from a brand like that, to know that we actually respond in a way that is in accordance with the law.
How do you see the landscape of compliance and governance evolving in the next 10 years?
I believe it will continue to take on a much stronger role, as we've seen in the last few years. Now, there's expectations out there for companies to do what is right, to act ethically. This is what consumers currently want, and the general public expects this also from multinational companies. The world has become very conscious, and I think a lot of our listeners can also relate to that, where when you consume a product, when you use infrastructure, you want to know that what went on behind that isn't something untoward, that there's care for the environment, that people earned a decent living while actually building that. And I think that pressure is increasing. We're seeing a lot being rolled out on the ESG side from a governance perspective. But when we really just look to the public, think of you and me, the people we know, people and consumers have become conscious. They expect something better and bigger from corporate entities. They want entities that they can trust.
Is Siemens doing anything to prepare for the future compliance and governance landscape?
So we stay abreast of what's going on in the world. And going back to the earlier question, we've got also the central team monitoring the type of legislation that's being rolled out. So that's one of our strongest ways of how we are preparing. We're preparing constantly as things change, as we see new legislation being rolled out. One example is, as I've mentioned, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. We're seeing similar legislation also in other European countries and even at EU level. So that's in essence also how we anticipate that and how we prepare for the future. But a big part, of course, is on the technological advancements, artificial intelligence, a lot of the new type of business models. That's something that we also constantly evolve as an organization, because a response to that can also not be defined today. It can change from year to year. So we also try to change as fast as the technology does at the moment.
Can you share personal experience where you saw the direct impact of strong compliance and governance practices?
We take decisions on a weekly basis, which customers to not work with, which partners not to work with. And that's really where we see how this approach also works. And unfortunately, it's not visible, or should I even say fortunately, because that's how we steer clear also of running into compliance issues. So it's something I see personally on a weekly basis, I would say.
Is there any advice you'd like to give to companies looking to strengthen their compliance and governance frameworks?
I wouldn't so much call it advice. I'd perhaps just say my personal experience and my view. A value-based system for me is everything. I come from a legal background. I believe in laws and regulations, but I believe it's so important to understand why it's there, that value behind it. And that's also something that we see in our business conduct guidelines and our ethical principles. It's not just about blind compliance with the law. What does it help we have a law in place, and if it isn't there, will we just act in a different way? I think for me, that's always that meaning behind why a law is there. Value-based approach, that our employees share our values, that we don't have a fear-based system where everyone is just trying to comply with the rules, but that we see how we form part of this bigger world and how our compliant behavior also contributes to a better future.
And I think my final question to you is, where can our listeners learn more about Siemens South Africa's compliance and governance initiatives?
Well, firstly, speak to us. I think it's a very important one. Our door is open for questions, general type of topics. We're always there to talk. Ask questions. Speaking up is not always just about reporting wrongdoing. It's also about asking questions when we become unsure, when we see new things developing. And then secondly, also, of course, on our intranet page, there's some of the basic information also linking to some of our global initiatives. And also keep an eye out for some of our communications on Viva Engage. We will also try to keep people abreast of what we're doing.
Thank you so much, Charles. And that wraps up today's episode of In Conversation With. Thank you, Charles, for joining me today and sharing your expertise and insights on compliance and good governance. Your input has been invaluable to our discussion today. I've been your host, Buitumelo Masikit. Thanks again for listening. And until next time, remember that at Siemens, ethics isn't just a guideline, it's the cornerstone of our success. See you next time.